Thank you very much to Barry Morishita and everybody at AUMA for this invitation to speak to your first and let's hope your last virtual online AUMA annual general meeting. And let me begin by thanking all of you for your local leadership through these remarkably challenging last 7 months of unprecedented challenge for the people of Alberta. I think none of us, when we decided to take the step into public service and put our name on a ballot for election, none of us imagined where we would find ourselves in 2020. But we have been dealt this challenge, and together, I believe Albertans are rising to the challenge and showing the world the depth of our resilience, the strength of our character, and really the entrepreneurial culture of this province in addressing the huge challenges posed to us by the global pandemic. We all know that Alberta has been hit by a triple whammy, by the largest public health crisis since the Spanish flu of 1918, the largest global economic contraction since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the largest collapse of energy prices in absolute terms in history. Let's not forget that 3 months ago we were selling Western Canada Select oil at negative prices on the futures markets, unprecedented. And all of those huge challenges layered on top of 5 years of economic adversity. There's no point in trying to deny the reality. This year, Alberta's economy, our GDP, will be lucky to clear $300 billion. 5 years ago, we had a provincial GDP of over $360 billion. We have seen the evaporation effectively of 20% of our province's economic output. And the costs of that in real people's lives is serious, profound, and a challenge for all of us. And that is why Alberta's government, our approach over these past 7 months has been to focus on both protecting lives but also livelihoods. We have recognized from the beginning that while we had to flatten the curve and limit the spread, that we could not take measures that would impose even more serious economic and social damage, because we know that for every public health restriction that is imposed, there are unintended and negative consequences. But let me just say for a moment how grateful I am to Albertans and to the local government partners with whom we have worked for your tremendous responsibility in addressing the public health challenge of the pandemic. And really it's been about personal responsibility, because Alberta took a different approach than most other jurisdictions across the Western world. We had, at the peak of the pandemic, by far the least restrictive public health measures in Canada, and much less restrictive than in almost all of the United States or European countries, and yet we have had some of the best public health outcomes through most of the past 7 months, with the lowest level of COVID-19 infections, hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and COVID-related fatalities of the large population provinces, lower than all of the U.S. states and all of the European countries. And we did that, at the height of the pandemic, with restrictions that allowed 85% of Alberta's businesses to continue to function safely within public health guidelines, representing nearly 90% of our workforce and about 95% of our provincial GDP. We moved forward to reopen those aspects of the economy that had been suspended more broadly and more quickly. I'll just give you an example. Ontario and Quebec suspended all of the manufacturing and construction sectors. We allowed them to continue to operate, and so there are people in your municipalities who were able to put food on the table, businesses that were able to continue to generate the taxes that pay for our public services, all of that because we took an approach that focused on public education and trusting people to exercise personal responsibility. And I want to thank all of you for cooperating with that direction. I also want to acknowledge the tremendous work of our brilliant Alberta Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, and her team, as well as, of course, everybody at Alberta Health Services. At the peak of the pandemic, people are talking about waves. The truth is, we never really had a serious first wave. It's a very serious challenge and threat, of course. Our goal has always been to flatten the curve to avoid an overwhelming of our healthcare system, and by that measure, we have, as a province, as a people, performed remarkably well. At the peak of the pandemic, we had opened up 3,800 acute care hospital beds. We never had more than 150 occupied by COVID-19 patients. And we are concerned, of course, to see a slight increase in the number of active cases, and that's why we need to maintain our vigilance and your continued cooperation at the municipal level in that regard. Having said that, through most of the past several weeks, we have seen fewer than 10 Albertans in intensive care because of COVID-19. And I'm pleased to report, that a piece of good news. We see that the number of COVID-19 related infections amongst student-aged children and youth between the ages of 5 and 18 has actually declined since the schools restarted 3 weeks ago. So still early data, but encouraging nevertheless. And I think that underscores an important point. There were a lot of voices in the debate about reopening Alberta's schools who, quite frankly, I think, were irresponsibly spread a message of fear and anxiety. There's enough anxiety in our communities already, and I think it's the responsibility of leaders to take difficult decisions, but to send a message to everybody to keep calm and to carry on because we are all in it together. Now, as I said, we need to be mindful of the fact that for every public health restriction, there are going to be some serious negative, broader social and economic consequences that will impact people's health as well. And one example of that, of course, is the huge increase in opioid-related deaths. We've seen, for the most of the last year, a encouraging decline in the number of opioid-related overdoses and deaths. But that clearly turned around with the pandemic. And it's not limited to Alberta. This is a trend we've seen all across Canada. Our early analysis suggests that the beginning of the pandemic and certain public health restrictions really disrupted many people with addictions who were in the early stages of treatment. And we took measures with the cooperation of Dr. Hinshaw and her team to try to ensure the operation of treatment centers, which of course we are expanding with Alberta's addiction long-term treatment and recovery action plan, supported by the $150 million investment, the appointment of an Associate Minister of Addictions and Mental Health, who's working with many of your communities on how significantly to increase addiction and mental health services. Alberta's government also provided $53 million additional dollars of mental health-related support, related to COVID-19. And so if you're facing a particular challenge in these areas in your community, please reach out to Associate Minister Lawan and his team to see how we can work together for those who are fighting addictions during this especially challenging time. But one of the things that concerns me most in my position is the impact that all of this has on the morale of people, and of course so much that is connected to the economy. Let me quote to you from an email I received from one of my Calgary-Lougheed constituents recently named Michael. He emailed me last week to say, "I have not had a full-time job in over 2 years. I have a wife and 2 kids, no health or dental coverage, no cash left, and 0 RRSP or pension funds, as I've had to drain this out just to survive. I can't compete for roles in my professional field of project controls as there is no capital investment at all, and 0 opportunity to change career paths when hundreds of people with experience apply to every position. Over half of our people are broke and are looking at poverty and economic ruin as the new normal." None of us put our name on a ballot for politics. I believe all of us did it for people. We need to remind ourselves every day of people like Michael and what they are going through up and down our province. People, so many of whom are Albertans by choice, who moved here because they saw this as an opportunity society. And right now they're wondering if that opportunity still exists. The central message I want to convey to you, mayors, councillors, local leaders of this great province, is that every decision we make in the months and years to come must be focused on people like Michael, on restoring economic security, opportunity, and a sense of hope for those who have been experiencing despair, a despair deepened by the pandemic. And that means we must all work together, focused, yes, on protecting lives in the pandemic, but also on protecting livelihoods with a relentless focus on economic growth, on job creation, on economic recovery through and out of the crisis. And that is why, first of all, through the crisis, Alberta's government has provided $15 billion in fiscal support, everything from small business restart grants, home isolation payments at the beginning of the pandemic for those who had to stay home because of concern about infection, the tax deferrals, fee deferrals, liquidity delivered to businesses and households through Alberta Treasury branches, the $500 million in cost share support for municipalities through the Safe Restart Agreement, recognizing that you too, in your governments, have taken a hit on your revenues and seen increases in social expenditures to cope with the crisis. So that is what we've done over the past 7 months. But in late June, Alberta's government also launched our Alberta Recovery Plan. We were the first government in Canada to launch a comprehensive strategy for economic recovery through and after the crisis. It is a bold plan to build, to diversify, and to create tens of thousands of good jobs now and well into the future. One central aspect of Alberta's recovery plan is the largest ever build program, infrastructure program, in our province's history, a $10 billion expenditure this year. We are already at about a $7 billion commitment to infrastructure, including through the MSI in this year's budget pre-COVID. But we have added over $3 billion to that, including, as you know, $500 million in transfers to municipalities to support your infrastructure priorities as part of the COVID recovery. We estimate that the $10 billion infrastructure build this year should support the creation of about 50,000 good-paying construction jobs as part of our counter-cyclical effort to stimulate demand right now when it is needed most. But we ask that in the projects you select, that they be shovel-ready, they get in the ground and get people to work as soon as possible, and they also help to improve long-term economic productivity. This is in addition to the $1.1 billion in additional funding for provincial infrastructure priorities. And basically, those priorities are coming off of municipal submissions as well. In almost every case. So we are supporting municipalities in building critical infrastructure, like, for example, the expansion of Lethbridge Ag Exhibition, the twinning of Terwilliger Drive through southwest Edmonton, the recently announced Calgary Stony Trail Bridge, and much more. And we've been working with a number of you, mayors and councillors, on additional projects. It's also in addition to $200 million in support for water and wastewater projects and STIP projects. Again, most of those are matters of priority for municipalities. And finally, it involves a doubling of the province's capital maintenance and repair budget. Again, a lot of that work being done in municipalities to support your local infrastructure and our productivity as a provincial economy. Alberta's recovery plan, of course, also involves the core of it is to make this province especially during these tough times, the most attractive place in North America in which to invest to create jobs. That's why we accelerated the job creation tax cut on July the 1st, completing the 1/3 reduction of Alberta's business tax rate to make us by far the most attractive place from a fiscal standpoint to invest in Canada, and one of the most in North America. It's why we are accelerating our red tape reduction strategy. Our target is a 1/3 reduction of the number of regulatory requirements imposed by Alberta's government. And we're making very good progress on that because, as you know, we had been rated as the most over-regulated economy in Canada. Our goal is to become the freest and fastest moving in North America. And let me pause there to say that these policies were informed in part by our brilliant economic recovery panel, or advisory committee, chaired by Professor Jack Mintz, which involves former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, some of the leading business leaders in our province. And they said to us that many major businesses around the world are taking a step back and looking at their footprint, looking at their workforce strategy, looking at where they are located. And their advice to us was to take measures immediately that would get Alberta on the radar screen. Part of this also involves the creation of the new Invest Alberta agency. We'll be taking our network of offices around the world and rebooting them to focus more on inbound investment promotion. They'll continue to support outbound export market promotion, but the investment promotion element of this is critical. And in this, we very much want to work through Invest Alberta with your local economic development agencies and in cooperation, so that we are working as Team Alberta in promoting investment. It's also why we've introduced the Innovation Employment Tax Credit, the revised and expanded petrochemical incentive program, and much more. Now, let me make a very clear point. When I speak to major business leaders about prospective investment in Alberta, very often a message that I hear back is that the greatest impediments they've experienced are at the local level, at the municipal level. Let me begin by saying thank you to mayors and councils and municipal administrations that have taken real steps to focus on attracting new investment, on economic growth, on reducing red tape, on speeding up approvals, and on keeping taxes at a reasonable level. Thank you for those of you who have made tough decisions to support pro-growth policies. But that is not universally the case across the province. I'm not going to name names here, but I know of one manufacturing company that would like, in principle, to add another shift that would create 400 good-paying jobs in an Alberta community, but they are impeded from doing so because of a municipal noise bylaw. Folks, this is the time when we have to get first things first. We have to put, at the depth of a crisis like this, those 400 jobs matter a lot more than a few noise complaints from local residents. I have another fantastic Alberta entrepreneur who spent 3 going on 4 years to invest tens of millions of dollars in expanding his business, which would also be a tourism draw for a community that is struggling. And he was so frustrated with the inability to get to yes on local regulations because of impediments from bylaws that are were written 50 years ago. He and his company were this close to pulling out and canceling the whole investment that's creating dozens of local jobs. That's just not excusable. Finally, we did get to yes in that case, but it took too long. I recently had a visit from the president of one of Canada's largest commodities companies, who actually showed me his property tax bill for a new plant he built here in Alberta, compared to the property tax bill in Saskatchewan and one for an identical plant in North Dakota. He was paying 8 times more in property tax here in Alberta, and said as long as that continues to be the case, he will not invest another cent in this province. So the message I'm trying to send to you with clarity is, please do everything you can at this time of crisis to strip away unnecessary rules, red tape, and costs that may be impeding investment and job creation now more than ever. And the key mandate I've given to our brilliant new Minister of Municipal Affairs, Tracy Allard, is to work with you on the jobs and growth agenda so that as Team Alberta, we are all part of the recovery plan. Let me mention one last thing before I close, which is the huge fiscal challenge that we are facing as a province. In my televised address to Albertans at the height of the crisis in April, I said that our focus is on lives and livelihoods, and that remains the case. But with the collapse of revenues and the huge increase in spending to support people through the crisis, we have now, as a province, gone into a deep fiscal crisis. As I said, there will be at some point in the future a great fiscal reckoning. And the challenge for us as a provincial government and for all of us as leaders of government in Alberta is at the very least, even through this crisis, to find ways to operate as efficiently as possible, but also to prepare ourselves for more difficult decisions down the road. We all know that this is the case. We, as Minister Tays reported in our August update, a $24 billion provincial deficit. To put that in context, back in 1993, when the Klein government reduced spending by 20%, the entire stock of the accumulated debt of Alberta at that point was $9 billion. We have seen the evaporation of $12 billion of revenue this year. To put this in context, Alberta used to get about $10 billion in non-renewable resource revenues. In the last few years, it was about $5 billion. This year, it's down to $1 billion, with collapse in all of our revenue sources. And even if those come back post-COVID in the recovery, we estimate that we'll still have a structural deficit of at least $10 billion. And we do not want to end up living in a province like other jurisdictions where we end up spending more and more on debt service costs to the bankers and bondholders and less available for public services. So we will have to be part of this. I said half-jokingly to Mayor Iveson after he joined me at the announcement about the Safe Restart Agreement, I said, Don, you better cash that check now because the next one might bounce. So folks, we need all to work together, and that is also going to be a challenge for Minister Allard in working with you. Finally, let me say that the importance of us acting as Team Alberta, not just on jobs and growth here, but in getting a fair deal for our province. I was very disappointed with this week's federal throne speech. It was nearly 7,000 words long, with zero recognition of the unique economic crisis facing energy-producing provinces, including Alberta, and the great anxiety that that has created. There was no acknowledgement of the lack of fiscal fairness. But I want you to know, and please convey to your constituents, that we Albertans are not isolated. We have allies and friends across the country who recognize the nation-building a role that Alberta has played in modern Canadian economic history. We have all 10 provinces, all 3 territories, who have backed us up repeatedly on our call for lifting the cap on the fiscal stabilization program, which is supposed to be there for have provinces during an economic crisis. And without that cap, we would be entitled to receive $6 billion of fiscal stabilization, which is, in my view, that's Albertans' money. That's a small fraction of the over $630 billion net that we've contributed over the past 50 years to the Federation through the system of fiscal federalism. And so please join your voices to ours and other provinces and territories in asking the federal government to recognize that Alberta's been good to the rest of Canada, and it's Canada's time to be good to Alberta during this time of great trial. One area where we can work together in a stronger Alberta, I believe, is on reviewing our approach to police services. Of course, many of you operate your own municipal police services, but Alberta has a RCMP contract for most regions of the province. I believe in principle that we could get a much more effective community policing model with a provincial police service, which is why, following the recommendations of the Fair Deal panel and input from grassroots Albertans, the Minister Madhu and his department are working on a deep study on the prospective cost, benefits, and structure of a possible provincial police force. Many of you have experience in operating your own local police forces and can help to inform that process. Let me close by saying, as challenging as these times are, I truly believe that Alberta will come out of this crisis stronger than ever. That is who we are as people. Those who built this province, who went, our First Nations people who overcame remarkable adversity to build communities here. Those who founded this province and went on to survive through the Depression and the great drought of the 1930s and 2 world wars. The resilience of Albertans is limitless. I was speaking at the height of the crisis to Louis Vachon, the president of the National Bank down in Montreal, at a time when we weren't able to sell Alberta government bonds. And he said to me, he said, Jason, you know, it doesn't matter how tough it gets right now, how low commodity prices, oil prices go, because your most important asset, he said, is the entrepreneurial culture of your people. He said, I've worked all around the world and all across Canada, and there is nothing like the entrepreneurial culture of Albertans. I have seen that entrepreneurial culture reflected in our public services, in our public servants, in their response to the COVID crisis. I've seen it in civil society, in the remarkable charitable nonprofit and individual initiatives to reach out to those in need of support over the past 7 months. And so, friends, I just want to call on all of us to dig deep, to show that sense of resilience and of hope, because together we'll come out of this stronger than ever. Thank you very much, and thanks for your public service. God bless Alberta.